This model is really the engine behind the whole 363 report. There are two basic layers. The first layer is the 8 approaches. Each of those represents a broad category of leadership, and they're not mutually exclusive. In fact, the approaches that are adjacent to each other have a lot more in common. And so if someone's high in the energizing approach, then they're more likely to be high in the pioneering approach. On the other hand, when we look at someone who's very high in the energizing approach, they're a lot less likely to be high on the deliberate approach. So, much like DiSC, this is a circumplex. Things across from each other in the circle are less related, and then things adjacent to each other are more related. And then each approach has 3 practices underneath it. And so these are basically subcategories. So, for example, the affirming approach has practices underneath it like being approachable, like acknowledging contributions, and creating a positive environment. All of these things add up to being very affirming and coming across as affirming. Now, one question that comes up a lot is, how does this relate to DiSC? And you'll see as you go through the report, DiSC is not explicitly addressed in the report, but it is behind the scenes. In the process of assessing the leader, we do actually gather their DiSC style. And so that information is used to provide context, provide narrative to help explain and help the person get a better understanding of what their feedback means. So if the participant isn't DiSC literate, then that's fine. They don't need to know DiSC in order to use this tool. On the other hand, if the participant is DiSC literate, this can really help out with the facilitation of the tool and help them to gather some additional insights. Another really good question is, do I have to have mastery over each one of these areas to be an effective leader? The simple answer is no. You don't have to be an expert. There are going to be certain areas that aren't natural for you, and they're probably never going to be natural. On the other hand, all of these things, whether or not we're talking about the approaches or practices, are really important in leadership. And so having some basic level of competency in all of them really is needed, or they're going to start to hamper your effectiveness. Of course, providing a real specific definition of what is a basic level of competency is tricky. When we get into the report, we'll see that the average for most of these scales tend to be around 5.5 on a 7-point scale. And I would say that for most people, anything in the 4 range is really a red flag and worth exploring. But the point I'm trying to make here is on a more conceptual level, and that is none of these 24 practices or 8 approaches are things that you can blow off. You may not be fantastic at all of them, and it may not be a good use of your time to try to be an expert in every single area, but at the same time, you can't ignore them. If you're clearly deficient in one of these areas, it's going to cause problems for you, and it's going to cost your leadership effectiveness. And then a final question that we do here is, where do these approaches come from? Where do these practices come from? And it's important to note that this is not intending to cover the entire domain of leadership. Things like intelligence or honesty or character or even job knowledge are not included in here. This is just addressing the interpersonal aspects of leadership. And the development of this model was actually approached in 2 different ways. There was one direction we were coming at it in terms of the DiSC model and what does DiSC have to say about leadership. The second angle, and perhaps even more important, is what are the contemporary and traditional best practices in leadership? What do the experts have to say? And as we started collecting data, what we found was a very cool and robust relationship between some of these age-old principles and even more of the contemporary principles as well, and what DiSC has to say about the person. And so you'll see areas like energizing or affirming in Kouzes and Posner's work. But if you read Jim Collins' work on, let's say, level 5 leadership, he talks a lot about the need for leaders to be humble and to have resolve. This model helps to integrate these different approaches and understand how they relate to each other in a way that both conceptually and statistically is supported very well by the data. The research, in fact, has been very supportive, suggesting that this model really does reflect the actual practice of leadership in the real world. And I'd actually encourage you to read the white paper that we have available that not only goes into the research and the statistical findings behind this model, but will also very clearly help you see the relationship between these approaches and practices and the contemporary and traditional writings on leadership.